Let's make my Navi Stars quilt pattern that uses 9 fat quarters and 4 yards of background fabric, yielding you a 66-inch by 66-inch square quilt. The fabric I am using is Dusk Fusion and Volcanic Deco Stitch, all from Art Gallery Fabrics. For this quilt, I highly recommend starching your fabrics as we will be making a ton of half square triangles. Let's get started. With each fat quarter, you will cut 4 5-inch squares and 16 3-inch squares. On video, my fat quarter is laid out where the 18-inch is going from left to right. There is enough fabric if you end up with a crooked fat quarter bundle or if your fabric has large salvages. Feel free to use the remaining bits as a scrappy binding. There won't be enough, but you can scrapify it more or create a binding like pattern designer Elizabeth Hartman. Repeat these cuts to all of your 9 fat quarters. Then with your background fabric, cut out 36 5-inch squares and 144 3-inch squares. The remaining yardage will be used for your sashing and border. All of these measurements will be listed down below in the video's description. Now let's create one quilt block. You will be using the same print throughout your entire quilt block, and you will need 4 5-inch squares and 16 3-inch squares in both your print and background fabrics. Since I am using a black background, on my prints on the wrong side of the fabric, I am drawing a 45-degree line from corner to corner with a fabric marking tool. Then let's start with our 5-inch squares and place them right sides together and sew a 1/4-inch seam allowance on both sides of the line you drew. And here is a tip. Since we are making a ton of half square triangles, I normally sit at my sewing machine and chain each piece continuing to sew on one side first. Then after my 5-inch squares, I will repeat it with my 3-inch squares. Here is an example. I pieced all of my 5-inch squares and 3-inch squares, sewing that 1/4-inch seam allowance on the left side of the 45-degree line, and since they are all chain pieced together on the back of my machine, it created a nice little pile for me. I'll swing that pile around to the front of my machine and sew the other side with a 1/4-inch seam allowance. And since it created that nice little pile, it will sort of feed itself. You just have to line it up. I usually lower my sewing speed so that way I can line up the next square units, and this actually speeds up the process significantly for me. And I hope this is a helpful tip for you. Then once I have sewn my 1/4-inch seam allowance on both sides, I will separate the chain and cut on the line with fabric scissors, leaving you with 32 2.5-inch square triangles and 8 4.5-inch square triangles. Side note, I highly recommend pressing your seams open. I tried to avoid this as I always burn myself, but after making a block with my seams pressed to the side, it became an annoying nightmare. So I recommend pressing your seams open. Also, don't forget to square your quilt blocks. Now let's create a smaller block unit. Take 4 2.5-inch half square triangles and create this block shown. Sew your blocks into rows, and lastly, sew your rows together to complete a 4.5-inch block. Repeat this step until you have made 4 quilt blocks. Now we will create another smaller block unit. Take 4 2.5-inch square triangles and create this block down below. Sew your blocks into rows, and lastly, sew your rows together to complete a 4.5-inch quilt block. Repeat this step until you have 4 quilt blocks. Now that our smaller units are created, it is time to create our larger unit, and you will need one of each of your smaller units you just created and 2 4.5-inch half square triangles. Place your blocks out like so. Sew your blocks together into rows, and lastly, sew your rows together to complete a 8.5-inch quilt block. Repeat this step until you have 4 quilt blocks. With those 4 larger units, you will rotate them around to create our final look. Sew your blocks together in 2 rows, and lastly, sew your rows together to now complete a 16.5-inch quilt block. Repeat this step until you have a total of 9 quilt blocks. Now that all of your blocks are complete, it is time to lay them out in a 3 by 3 block layout with sashing between each block and row. Because I am working with a large quilt block, stay till the end to see a larger photo of the layout. You will cut your background sashing strips at a 4.5-inch by width of fabric. Between each quilt block, your sashing should measure as a 4.5-inch by 16.5-inch rectangles. However, for my beginner quilters, measure your blocks out first and cut 4.5-inch by whatever your final block measurement is. And once again, it should be a 16.5-inch square. Then, as always, sew your blocks and sashing into rows, then your rows and sashing together to complete the base of your quilt top. For your border, you will cut 5.5-inch by width of fabric strips. I've already done so and added them to my quilt. So here is what my quilt looks like all completed. For the backing, I am using a coordinating print from within the collection. Then for the thread choice, I am going with glide threads in the color black to match my background fabric. And here is what my quilt looks like all quilted out. Here is a close-up to see the quilting. I use Interstellar from So Shabby Quilts. Link will be in the description. However, I did scale it up a little bit. Normally it's around 15 inches tall, but I blew it up to 18 inches. Once again, your quilt will yield a 66-inch by 66-inch square quilt. And here are some photos to give you a better idea of the layout. Now I do hope you have enjoyed today's tutorial. If you could please take a moment to hit that like and subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you can be notified for your next amazing quilt project.